And welcome to the third of six Jewish Book Council online talks. I'm Miri Pomerantz Dauber, the director of Jewish Book Council's Book Club Department, and I'm excited to be here speaking with author Mati Friedman. A quick note about Jewish Book Council. Jewish Book Council is a not-for-profit organization dedicated to the promotion of books of Jewish interest. Find out more about us at www.jewishbookcouncil.org. The National Jewish Book Club is a new program of JBC's Book Club Department. Each year, Jewish Book Council selects 16 titles, both fiction and nonfiction, from the breadth of Jewish literature. These titles are presented in a guide with information on each book and discussion questions. For more information, visit the Book Club section of JBC's website. This program is designed to allow participants to engage with the books in the way that interests them the most and includes this series of 6 online conversations that take place every other month. And now, Mati Friedman. Mati is an author who we've had the pleasure of working with through a number of JBC programs, including an author tour, and as the winner of our 2014 Semi-War Prize for Jewish Literature. Mati's work as a reporter has taken him from Lebanon to Morocco, Cairo, Moscow, and Washington, D.C., and to conflicts in Israel and the Caucasus. He has been a correspondent for the Associated Press, where he specialized in religion and archaeology in Israel and the Palestinian territories, as well as for the Jerusalem Report and the Times of Israel. He grew up in Toronto and lives in Jerusalem. You may have seen Mati's name around a lot this summer from an article that he wrote about working as a correspondent for the AP and coverage over Israel. The Aleppo Codex, his first book, was published in May 2012 by Algonquin Books of Chapel Hill. It won the 2014 Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature and was selected as one of Booklist's top 10 religion books of the year, was awarded the American Library Association's Sophie Brody Medal and the Canadian Jewish Book Award for History, and was a finalist for the Religion Newswriters Association Award. Mati, thank you so much for joining us. For those of you watching, Mati's in Jerusalem, so he's taking time out of his evening to be with us. If you have questions for Mati, please feel free to ask by using the Q&A button on the top right of your screen and just type in your question. So Mati, now that the book has been published in so many countries, have you received different reactions, and how was the book received in Israel?
First of all, thanks so much for having me. The book was received in Israel in a very different way than it was received in the United States. I think in the United States it was seen as kind of more as a mystery that happened to be true, and it kind of taught people a few things that they didn't know about founding of Israel and certain tensions that existed in Israel, and a story that people just hadn't heard about, a book that I think people hadn't heard about. In Israel, the reaction was a bit different, because in Israel, the tensions that are kind of implicit in the story, mainly the tension between Jews of European descent, who made up the elite of the country in its early years, and Jews who came from the Middle East, that tension is very much present in the country today. So some of the responses were very much inspired by that. They saw it more as a story of exploitation by Jews of European descent, Ashkenazim, of a weak community from the Middle East. It's still a very sensitive topic here. The Jewish population of Israel is split roughly 50-50 between Jews who came from Europe and Jews who came from the Middle East. And although those lines are becoming more and more blurred, they still exist, and that tension still exists. So the response to the book in Israel had a lot more to do with that. And of course, the institutions that I end up criticizing in the book are far more familiar to Israelis than they are to Americans, and the figures in the book are more familiar to Israelis than they are to Americans. It's less of a theoretical story for people here. So I would say that the response in Israel was a bit more visceral.
Did any of those institutions comment directly on your book?
Yes. The Ben-Zvi Institute, which ends up bearing the brunt of the criticism in the book, it's an institute in Jerusalem that's dedicated to the study of the Jewish communities of the East. And they're also the de facto owners of the Aleppo Codex today. They were furious about the book. They haven't managed to disprove anything that's written in it, but they have made a few angry and dismissive comments about it. Certain families connected to characters of whom I'm critical in the book responded, but no one managed to find any errors, and the thing seems to be airtight.
Wow. So are you still involved in the Codex Underground, and have you learned anything new since publication?
The investigation into the fate of the Aleppo Codex continues on kind of a low flame. There are still people trying to find new leads. There are people who have their finger on the pulse, and I'm in touch with them. Some of them are characters in the book, mainly Ezra Kassim, who's one of the important characters in the book. He's kind of an amateur Aleppo Codex sleuth. And then occasionally we'll get little pieces of information or rumors. People have contacted members of the Aleppo Codex Underground. It never pans out, and no significant information has arisen since the publication of the book. So I have two kind of contradictory responses to that. One is that it's unfortunate because I wish we had new information, and I think that there is information out there that when it emerges is going to be incredibly interesting and exciting. So I'm kind of sorry that we're not getting anything new. On the other hand, as a reporter, it reassures me that I did my work, that I covered all of my bases, because had I written a book that had immediately been followed by an outpouring of fascinating information that rendered my book outdated or perhaps incorrect, I would not have been happy about that either. So there is an upside to the lack of new information on the Aleppo Codex mystery.
So you wrote initially, when you started writing, you thought you'd be writing a heartening story of the rescue of this book, only to discover a much darker story. Did you sort of become disillusioned as you were following this? And do you think, particularly as you're talking about readers in the States who might not have heard of the Codex in the past, do you think some of them may be feeling some of that disillusionment as well?
Yes, I mean, when I went into the story, I did think that it was going to be a nice Jewish story about the greatest book in Judaism and how it was lost and found, and how it was rescued from a hostile country and brought home to Jerusalem. That's very much the story that's told about it officially. And as I delved deeper into the mystery, it became clear that wasn't the story. And the longer that I spent on it, kind of the dirtier the story became, and the more interesting it became, and journalistically more rewarding. But yes, it was more and more disappointing, because the human failures in the story and kind of all of the aspects of the story are hard to ignore. So it kind of became a story about that, which is not initially what I was looking for, and it's not what I generally look for as a journalist. I'm not looking for disturbing stories necessarily, but of course you can't ignore them when they're staring you in the face. And I think that yes, some readers might have shared that sense. I think some people find it difficult to read critical reporting about Israel or critical writing about Israel. People kind of often want to believe either really uniformly good things about the country or uniformly bad things about the country. One of the great things about living here and being Israeli is that we don't have that problem. So, I can write a very critical book, I think, about the state and certain actions undertaken by the state in its early years, and it doesn't bug me. I mean, I see that as my job as an Israeli journalist, and it doesn't undermine my faith in the country or my love for the country. It's just the way countries are.
Absolutely, and that's sort of countered with the piece you've written about how the media treats Israel that came out over the summer. That you could see it more critically and with less of a bias than what you've seen happening from other sources of journalism.
Right. I think it's really important to see this country as a country. I think there's so many expectations, often disappointed expectations, just heaped on this place that it's hard to see it straight. There's so much ideology that's involved here that it's hard to kind of cut through it and just figure out what's going on. There's so much bombastic speech, and the level of the volume level in the discussion of the country is so deafening that it's very difficult just to kind of look and write. So that's what I've tried to do, and that's what I'm trying to do in my next project, and that's what I'm trying to do in general. So I think the Aleppo Codex should be read that way. It's a critical work of journalism about things that I think deserve to be criticized, but it doesn't. The fact that it's not a very happy book about Israel necessarily doesn't mean that we need to be disillusioned with the whole place any more than the Watergate investigation meant that the idea of America should be flushed down the toilet.
Great. So we have a question from one of our viewers, Ruvain Warber, who asked, did you experience harassment or even threats about your findings from that came out in the Codex?
Thanks for the question. Not really, nothing serious. I received a kind of angry letter before the book was published after I approached the family of one of the characters for a response, but it never reached the level of harassment or threat. Last year, and I wrote a story about this for Tablet magazine called The Continuing Mysteries of the Aleppo Codex. Last year when I spoke at an Aleppo Jewish or Syrian Jewish synagogue in Brooklyn, one of the rabbis in the community issued a religious legal ruling against me, saying that I should not be allowed to speak at the synagogue, and if possible, I should not be allowed to visit New York City. It was a 4-page, kind of very dense halachic ruling with a lot of quotes in it. But again, no one slashed my tires, no one called me. So a lot of reporters have to deal with much worse stuff than I ever had to face in this investigation.
So was this experience of writing this book more of a long-form journalism piece, or was it more like writing a nonfiction history?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I expected it to be the latter. When I started, I expected it to be kind of a nonfiction or kind of a popular history, creative nonfiction kind of story about a manuscript, but very quickly it became an investigation. It became a kind of classic shoe leather investigation where you call people and they don't call you back, and you file freedom of information requests, and you knock on doors, and you knock on doors again and again and again. You sit in the archive, you sift through documents looking for contradictions or little scraps of information that might have been overlooked. So it became something much closer to a piece of investigative journalism than I had expected at the outset. And the final product, I think, is kind of a combination of the two. And I found the investigative part to be just so fun. I don't think I definitely had never done anything that serious as a reporter, and I had a great time doing it, and it was very rewarding. Great,
and I just want to remind viewers, if you have any other questions, to use the Q&A button. We're happy to take them. So at one point in the book, you note that in the middle of the War of Independence and fighting for their lives, I believe it was the War of Independence, Israeli leadership took the time and the resources to search for a book. Do you think this can be attributed to the focus of those specific leaders at the time, or is it a particularly Israeli or Jewish ethos to, in the middle of a war, go looking for a book? And if it is, do you think that ethos has continued today?
There are actually 2 incidents in the book where Israeli leaders during a war divert resources to looking for a book. So during the War of Independence in 1948, there's a meeting of important people who are involved in looking for the Codex and trying to get it out of Aleppo. And they meet at Mount Scopus when Mount Scopus is basically besieged, and students from the Mount Scopus campus of Hebrew University are engaged in making explosives for the Haganah. And yet, this book is deemed important enough to be worth their time in the middle of a war. During the same war, Haaretz publishes an obituary for the Codex when they think it's been burned. And this is at a time when 1% of the Jewish population had been killed in the War of Independence, and yet this book was deemed worth an obituary, which is quite striking. In another incident that I mentioned in passing in the book, in 1967, during the Six-Day War, Yigael Yadin, who is both a famous archaeologist and scholar and a former chief of staff who was advising the Israeli prime minister during that war, in the middle of the battle for Jerusalem, diverts a small intelligence detachment to look for one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Temple Scroll. And a few intelligence guys are sent from Jerusalem on the day that the Western Wall is captured by the paratroopers. They're sent to Bethlehem to look for one of the Dead Sea Scrolls that Yadin believes is being held by a dealer in Bethlehem, which has just been captured by the Israeli military. So you see this kind of recurring. I think that while the country still has an obsession with the written word and with books, which is a very not a new Jewish fixation, it's less so today. And I think that if you look at the leaders of the country then, there was a mix of kind of politics and scholarship, which was quite unique. So Ben Tzvi, who's one of the characters in the book, who's the second president of Israel, is also a scholar, and he's an important ethnographer. He writes books about kind of esoteric Jewish communities and Jewish communities in the Middle East. He taught himself 8 languages, and that was a very important part of who he was. And he was a Zionist leader and the second president of the state. And Yadin, who I mentioned, is both a chief of staff and an archaeologist. And so for these guys, there's Zionism and their scholarship and their own prestige and their scholarly prestige and the goals of the state. Everything's kind of mixed up in a big muddle, and that's less the case today. If you look at the country's leadership today, it's much less academic than the people who I mentioned, and it's kind of hard to imagine anything quite like that happening today.
So sort of along those lines, the people involved in the story in sort of modern times, from the book and also up through, I guess now, what you've discovered, do you think the value for the codex for them comes from the historical and religious significance, or more just the financial worth? You know, when you talk to that big collector and he says, if you don't have the money, you know, no one's going to talk to you. You know, that's a pretty big shift in viewing the codex as an object versus a text.
Right. I mean, there's a kind of an unholy meeting of holy texts and money, and they converge in this market in ancient manuscripts. So, you know, the holier a book is, or the more important or rare a book is, the more money it's worth. So the more spiritual value it has, the more monetary value it has, and kind of more polluted it becomes in the world of greed and money. And there's a character in the book who kind of dies, who was basically murdered in a hotel room in Jerusalem as a result of this convergence of holy books and money. The importance of the Codex is, at its root, the importance that the pages have for Jewish civilization. This is the most accurate copy of the Bible. It's the oldest complete copy of the Bible, and it is those things that give it its cash value. So I think that, you know, under the assumption that it is a collector who has some or all of the missing pieces of the Codex, I doubt very much that he owns it in order to sell it, or that someone has purchased this manuscript because he thinks it will appreciate in value, and that one day he'll sell it for more. People want to own it because it is a singular object, and there is no other object like it. And its financial worth, I think, is kind of, it adds some spice to the story. Of course, you know, it's great to have things that are worth a vast sum. But I really think that in the story of the Codex, the money is not the point.
That's nice. You know, sort of, this is a book that was safeguarded for 1,000 years and then only betrayed, sort of, as you said, betrayed in our times by the people charged with guarding it. That's a big shift from all, the entire history of the book, where people kept it safe, to a time when over 200 pages are missing. And you know, it's sort of nice to hear that you think that it's not just about the money. In your author's note, you talked about ebooks and how the power of a book is really about knowledge in it and what it can pass on to its readers. So this is a book that started out intending with that purpose of passing on as much knowledge as possible to the Jewish community, and then became a book that people never saw, you know, both when it was protected in Aleppo and then when it became a property or guarded by the Ben Tzvi Institute in Israel. So do you think a book that's widely read sort of does its job in some ways better than one that only a few have access to?
Yeah, I think that generally, yes, that the more people that read a book, the more power it has. Certainly, this book was written to be copied as much as possible. It was supposed to be used to perfect the text of the Bible as we have it. So it's not doing its job if it's kept hidden. It's meant to be a resource for everyone to use. In one of its first stops on its kind of long and fascinating journey, it ends up in Jerusalem, in the old city of Jerusalem, and it's owned by the Karaite Jewish community in Jerusalem. The Karaites are basically heretics as far as mainstream Judaism is concerned. They reject all the laws of the rabbis. They reject the oral law. All they have is the text itself. So you would expect relations between them and what we would now call mainstream Jews to have been quite hostile. But there's a page in the Codex, or there was, because it's one of the pages that has gone missing, that specifically tells us that on holidays, the owners of the Codex, the Karaites, would display it to all of the communities in Jerusalem. So it kind of transcended, it was deemed, or the public nature of the book was deemed so important that transcended the kind of sectarian feud that the Jews were having with each other at that time. There is something, however, about a book that's hidden that gives it a lot of power, that a book that's publicly available has. One of the things that makes the Aleppo Codex so kind of tantalizing is the fact that it exists in one copy, and the missing pages, the 200 missing pages, since they've gone missing, we don't have them. There are no copies of them. So that makes it more powerful in some ways than an ebook, for example, which exists in infinite copies and which anyone can have at any time, which makes it kind of less interesting. So there is, I guess, a little contradiction there that in the case of the Aleppo Codex, one of the things that gives it its power is the fact that it was hidden and the fact that so much of it is unavailable to us now.
Yeah, it's sort of amazing to think of a book that there really is only one copy of and some of it's missing. So if anyone else has any questions, please write in. I'm going to ask Mati one or two more questions, and then we'll start wrapping up. Mati, what are you working on now? I know you have a new book in with your publisher, I believe, that we're really excited to see. And this article that we mentioned earlier has definitely taken up some of your time for the past couple of months.
That's true. That's true. The next book, which is supposed to be out in about a year, is about a small number of Israeli infantrymen at an isolated outpost in South Lebanon in the 1990s, kind of at the moment of the birth of the new Middle East, the one that we're kind of watching unfold right now. So it's a very different book than the Aleppo Codex, but it's also nonfiction, and part of it's a memoir because I was a soldier at this outpost at that time. So it's an attempt to talk about a generation of Israelis that people don't know very much about. I sometimes think that the writing of Israel's history in English has kind of become stuck around the time of the Entebbe raid, more or less, and after that it becomes just kind of an endless screaming match about the settlements. But of course, Israel's history didn't stop in the 70s, and it's time that the writing of Israel's history in English kind of move on from that incredibly compelling time of Ben Gurion and Golda Meir and the Six-Day War and the events that are so fascinating and so strong that it's almost hard to stop talking about them. But I think that we need to kind of stop talking about them and we need to move on, and we need to investigate what the country is now, because what the country is now is a place that is as interesting as it was then. In many ways, I think it's a better country than it was then. It's a more complicated story that needs to be told now, but I think that it needs to be told, and I think people will find it engaging and interesting. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to do in this next book.
Great. We have another viewer question. The question is, weren't the writers of the Keter Ben Asher Karaites themselves?
That is a great question. I almost got into it in the book, and then I realized that was just opening up a whole can of worms that would take me off in a whole different direction. The answer is yes. As far as we know, incredibly, the people behind what mainstream Judaism deems to be the most accurate text of the Bible were Karaites, that is, members of essentially a sect of heretics as far as the rabbis are concerned. The guy who's done the most interesting work on this is Dr. Raphael Zer of Hebrew University, who's mentioned in the book. he wrote the article which kind of conclusively shows that Ben Asher was a Karaite. And it kind of makes sense because the Karaites didn't accept the oral law, and because they weren't into rabbis, and they kind of dismissed maybe 90% of what preoccupies rabbinic Jews. All they had was the text, so they were experts in the text. Their name, Karaites, means people of the text. So it is possible that in some way they were seen by the followers of the rabbis as people with very problematic theological views, but with an admitted expertise in matters of the text. Because it's just a fascinating fact that the people who created this version, which Maimonides considers to be the authoritative version of the Bible, were Karaites. They wouldn't have accepted Maimonides' authority at all. So it's another interesting wrinkle in the story of a very interesting book.
It is. In one of your meetings with one of the major collectors in the book, he says to you, "The story of the crown isn't over, it's only beginning." Do you agree, and what do you think he meant by that?
First of all, I always thought that should this ever be made into a movie, that would be a perfect line for the preview. I said in a kind of dramatic, booming voice that the story of the Codex is only beginning. I think that there's going to be another chapter in this story. I think that the pages, or at least many of the pages, are out there. They weren't burned. They weren't destroyed. They're out there, and someone has them, and they will surface. And when they surface, we're going to learn a few very interesting things about how they got wherever it is that they got to. So I don't know when it will happen, and I certainly hope that I'm not only alive, but that I'm functioning as a reporter so that I can cover it. But I think that there will be another fascinating chapter written in this story.
Well, we look forward to hearing it. Thank you. We're going to wrap up. Thank you, Mati, so much for taking time to speak with us, and thank you all for joining as viewers. This conversation will be archived on YouTube and will be available for viewing on the Jewish Book Council website as of the beginning of the week. So please check back, and our next conversation will be with author Tova Mervis in May. Mati, thank you again so much, and we hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me, Mary.